Buried somewhere in the parched earth of a cave in southern Oregon, a group of archaeologists uncovered something that had no business being there. They shipped it off to the lab, and the date that came back was so far off that they figured the equipment had malfunctioned. So they ran the test again with a fresh sample on a completely different machine, then a third time. Every single result pointed toward the same impossible conclusion. Whoever left this thing behind had been standing on American ground thousands of years before recorded history says any human set foot here. And what Oregon went on to reveal does not simply rewrite the story of how humans came to this continent. It incinerates it. The Oregon Cave. Stay right there in that cave with me for a moment. It goes by the name Paisley Caves, a series of dry rock shelters tucked away in south-central Oregon. And here is the part that nobody really wants to say out loud. Researchers had been aware of the place for decades. They just never dug down far enough, never examined it closely enough. Everyone took for granted that the question of who the first Americans were had already been answered, written up, published, and set in stone. So why bother pushing down through yet another layer of a dusty cave sitting in the middle of nowhere? But when a University of Oregon team finally worked their way down through the strata of the cave floor, what they recovered was not a spear tip. It was not any kind of tool. It was preserved human waste, dried and hardened, sitting right where some person had left it thousands and thousands of years ago. Paisley Cave in Oregon. The issue there is so-called human coprolites that were found there, and DNA was extracted from them, and some of these coprolites were dated and produced ages in the neighborhood of 13,000 years, if I remember correctly, which again would suggest that people arrived, at least in Paisley Cave in Oregon, before Clovis. These would be pre-Clovis dates. I know how that lands. A discovery that, unassuming, does not make the evening news, and it does not earn its own wing in a museum. But the bone-dry desert air of the high Oregon Plateau had done something no laboratory on the planet is capable of replicating. It had kept that delicate organic material intact, century after century, while everything else that ever existed inside that cave had decomposed into nothing. And locked within it was something a stone tool could never hand you. Not a shape, not an educated guess. Human DNA. They sequenced the mitochondrial DNA, and the result left absolutely no room for doubt. It matched the founding Native American haplogroups A2 and B2, not some failed migration that wandered in and fizzled out. The direct forebears of indigenous people alive and living in America at this very moment. People with names, with families, with a bloodline running in an unbroken line straight back into the dirt floor of a cave most of the world has never heard of. Sit with that for just a moment, because it is the piece that changes everything that is at stake. This was not some curiosity sitting behind glass. It was proof, written in living genetic code, that the oldest chapter of the American story never came to a close. That line is still here. The people who took shelter in that cave were not a dead end, not some doomed group that arrived too soon and disappeared without leaving a mark. Their descendants survived the Ice Age, survived the glaciers melting away, survived millennia of upheaval and chaos, and they are out there walking around today. And the evidence of the oldest known chapter of human existence on this continent was not a temple or a gleaming artifact. It was the most unremarkable thing a human body leaves behind, dried out on a cave floor, hiding in precisely the kind of evidence no archaeologist ever thinks to put on a poster. Then they dated it. The method used was accelerator mass spectrometry, which measures the age of the organic material itself, rather than the surrounding soil. That distinction carries far more weight than it might seem, because the standard objection to an impossibly ancient find is that the object shifted down from a shallower layer, or the sediment got disturbed, or the sample picked up contamination somewhere along the way. This technique cuts straight through all of those objections. It dates the object in your hand entirely on its own merits, calibrated. The result came back at more than 14,000 years before the present, at least 1,000 years before the Clovis people were even supposed to have set foot here. You need to grasp what that actually shatters. Through most of the 20th century, every textbook repeated the same neat, tidy narrative. The first Americans were the Clovis people, a name drawn from the distinctive spear points uncovered at a dig site in New Mexico. Those signature blades grooved down the middle to make them lighter and more lethal. The story held that they crossed a frozen land bridge out of Asia somewhere around 13,000 years ago, pushed southward through a corridor in the glaciers, and fanned out across a continent with no one in it. First to come, nothing before them. It was simple, it was easy to teach, and it was completely wrong. Careers had been constructed on top of it. Entire wings of museums had been organized around it, with Clovis hunters standing at the very front of the human timeline on this continent. Questioning that date was not merely questioning a number. It meant telling a great many influential people that everything they had spent their whole careers defending was nothing but a myth. Oregon had just driven 1,000 years between Clovis and the actual truth. The Clovis people were not first. They were not even remotely close. And Oregon was far from finished. A single date from one cave is exactly the kind of result the old guard can dismiss as an anomaly. One strange reading, contamination, maybe, just bad luck. They had done it before, plenty of times. But 70 miles from that cave, a second Oregon site was about to take what Paisley had found and push it down into something far more ancient and far more difficult to brush aside. Not a fluke this time around, but a pattern. And patterns are the things that bring careers to an end. If this is already getting under your skin, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because what a University of Oregon archaeologist pulled out of the earth 70 miles away is even harder to dismiss. This is the point where it stops being a conversation about a date and becomes a conversation about who these people genuinely were. Rimrock Draw. 70 miles from the Paisley Caves, just outside the town of Riley in Harney County, sits a place known as Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter. Dr. Patrick O'Grady, an archaeologist from the University of Oregon, has been excavating there since 2011. If you have ever imagined archaeology as one dramatic, cinematic moment of discovery, this site is the exact opposite. For years, it gave up almost nothing at all. A handful of obsidian flakes, a groundstone tool resting near the front of the shelter. The real artifact. This is genuine. Somebody held this roughly 12,000 years ago. And that's when it really hit me. I thought, yeah, the kind of patient, slow work, kneeling in the dirt, brushing, screening, that never ends up in any documentary. Season after season, year after year, with no guarantee that any of it would ever lead somewhere meaningful. Rimrock Draw did not deliver DNA. What it handed over was a clock. Buried within the soil was a distinct layer of white volcanic ash. Scientists matched it to a particular eruption of Mount St. Helens, dated to roughly 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. Somewhere beneath you there is water, so when something intensely hot rises up into that water, it heats it. Pressure builds and builds until it finally forces its way out in an explosion, like a pressure cooker letting everything loose at once. That ash layer governs the entire site. Anything recovered below it is older. Anything above it is more recent. There is simply no debating it. The layers cannot be shuffled around or reinterpreted. A volcano hundreds of miles away had erupted, carried its ash across the landscape, and sealed a lid directly over time itself. Everything lying beneath that lid had rested undisturbed since before the ash ever settled. This is precisely why Rimrock Draw carries so much weight alongside Paisley. The cave gave the scientific community a date and a strand of genetic material. Skeptics could always grumble about contamination, or a sample having worked its way down through the sediment. But a layer of volcanic ash is not a sample anyone can challenge. It is a firm line drawn through the earth by an event that no one could manufacture or manipulate. Whatever lies beneath it predates that eruption. Full stop. So when the team began recovering material from below that ash, they were not asking the laboratory to take their word for it. They were asking it to trust a volcano. Beneath that lid, O'Grady's team began pulling out objects that had no business being there. 27 tiny fragments of tooth enamel were sifted from the soil, emerging one by one. One of them turned out to belong to a camel from the day before, an Ice Age species that once wandered across North America and had been extinct for thousands of years. Another came from Bison antiquus, a larger and heavier relative of the modern American buffalo, also long vanished. These were not animals that had passed through sometime in the last century. These were creatures out of a lost world, the megafauna of the last ice age, and there they were, buried beneath the same ash, within the same earth, where a human tool would soon be uncovered. The picture taking shape inside that trench was of a landscape most people could never picture themselves standing in. Camels and massive bison moving across what is now the high desert of Oregon, and somewhere among them, a person holding a knife. Then the tool turned up. Orange chalcedony, a glassy variety of agate that catches light shaped into a single implement with a curved cutting edge, a flat scraping edge, and a serrated edge, worn completely smooth. O'Grady described it as an early Swiss Army knife, one object designed to handle multiple jobs. And the detail that really gets to you is the wear. Those small teeth along the serrated edge had been polished down. That kind of polish does not happen over a week or even a month. It takes years and years of steady use. Someone carried this object for a long time, sharpened it, resharpened it again, cut with it, scraped with it, sawed with it, and cut once more until the day they set it down inside that shelter, and for whatever reason, never returned to collect it. You are not staring at a rock. You are staring at the most prized possession of a person who lived and died an almost incomprehensible length of time ago. A tool worn smooth by the same kind of repeated daily handling that wears down a door handle or a house key today. That is the strange closeness a place like Rimrock Draw creates. Across 20,000 years, you can still read the pattern of one person's habits in the polish left on a blade. Here's the part that truly matters. The tool was sitting roughly 10 centimeters below the camel teeth. Deeper means older, so the tool predated the animals. And when the lab analyzed the animal teeth, the camel and bison dated back to somewhere around 21,000 to 22,000 years ago. O'Grady did not believe it. He ran the tests again. Same time frame, 2 samples, 2 separate independent tests, 2 matching results. Picture him sitting there staring at that second identical date, the one he had quietly been hoping would contradict the first. Instead, it did the opposite. It confirmed everything. He later admitted it was genuinely terrifying to be holding material that ancient, because you do not make an announcement like that without something absolutely solid beneath it, knowing full well what happens to the reputations of people who get it wrong. He had watched exactly that happen to others. Now he had 2 matching dates, and there was simply no way around it. The animals at Rimrock Draw had died more than 18,000 years ago, and the worn knife buried underneath them said a person had been present even earlier than that. And that knife was not Clovis. It belongs to something known as the Western stemmed tradition. Long blades, weak shoulders, rounded bases. It looks nothing at all like a Clovis point, and it predates the Clovis style by thousands of years. That is the quiet bombshell buried inside the date. For decades, the working assumption had been that every ancient tool found in the Americas must have descended from Clovis, because Clovis was supposed to be the origin point, the beginning, the very first hands to work stone on this continent. But a tradition that bears no resemblance to Clovis and is older than Clovis simply cannot have grown out of Clovis. It means a distinct group of people with their own techniques and their own way of understanding a piece of stone were already here. Different hands, different rules, an entirely separate tradition quietly developing in the shadows beneath the accepted story. Oregon now had 2 sites, 2 methods, and 1 message nobody was ready for. But when people this old were standing in Oregon, the question stops being whether the textbooks got it wrong. It becomes about how they arrived here and how far back this story truly reaches. Because the next clue did not come from Oregon at all. It came from a warning that had been screaming from the other side of the country for decades, and no one paid attention. The first crack. Decades before anyone started digging deep at Paisley, the first crack had already shown itself in a sandstone rock shelter in western Pennsylvania called Meadowcroft, sitting on a stream roughly 7 miles up from the Ohio River. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter is a large sandstone overhang in southwestern Pennsylvania, not far from where the state borders West Virginia. It sits within sandstone and siltstone stream deposits that date back to the Pennsylvanian or Carboniferous period, several 100 million years old. One archaeologist later called it a place that offered every attraction of a prehistoric holiday retreat, exactly the kind of sheltered, comfortable overhang where ancient travelers would have pulled over for the night without giving it a second thought. In 1955, a local historian named Albert Miller reached into a groundhog burrow on the property and pulled out artifacts that had absolutely no business being there. One handful of earth scooped from an animal tunnel, the very first loose thread of the whole thing. In 1973, a scientist named Jim Adavasio began excavating the shelter floor, peeling it back one deliberate layer at a time. And the deeper he went, the further back it reached. Stratum after stratum, the signs of human presence kept descending, going lower than the textbook said they had any right to go. This was not a man chasing some reckless theory. He was simply following the dirt downward, recording exactly what was in front of him. And the dirt kept telling him the same story the deeper he listened. When the radiocarbon dates came back, they showed humans had been at Meadowcroft as far back as 16,000 to 19,000 calibrated calendar years ago, thousands of years before Clovis. In July of 1980, Adavasio published his findings in American Antiquity and said the quiet part loud and clear. The Clovis first model was wrong. And his colleagues came at him immediately. Some accused him of working with contaminated samples. Others simply acted as though the paper had never been written, which in the world of science is its own particular kind of insult. Imagine being the man holding the correct dates while an entire field decides you must be the one who got it wrong. The resistance was so stubborn, so deeply personal, that researchers eventually gave it a name, Clovis Primacy Syndrome, and described its continued defense as anachronistic and futile. And it worked too. That is the uncomfortable part. Resistance like that is supposed to crumble as evidence continues to pile up. But this one dug in and held its ground for the long haul. Even now, decades on, one survey of working archaeologists found that only around 38% agreed with Adavasio's dates. Another 38% said they were not certain. The rest still reject them entirely. Read those numbers one more time. A finding that has held up for over 40 years still cannot win over more than a third of the field. Not because the evidence is fragile, but because accepting it means rewriting the careers and reputations of the very people doing the voting. So when Oregon's caves and Oregon's ash layer arrived, the field was already split right down the middle. Adavasio had taken those blows decades earlier, alone on the opposite side of the country. Oregon was the piece of evidence that made it impossible to keep looking away. The second voice that proved the first one had been right all along. And the moment you accept that the timeline is broken, a far worse question opens up. Because 700 miles south of Oregon, in a pale desert that nobody had ever bothered to map, there were footprints, 61 of them, left by people who were not supposed to exist. Ghost tracks in the White Sands. White Sands National Park is a vast field of pale gypsum dunes in southern New Mexico. So blindingly white and so perfectly still, it barely looks like it belongs on this planet at all. Back in 2009, researchers making their way across the dried-out bed of an ancient lake called Lake Otero began noticing shapes pressed into the gypsum surface. At first, nothing about them seemed remarkable, just impressions in the pale, hardened ground. But the longer they studied them, the more undeniable the picture became. Footprints, human footprints, and not just a couple of them. How humans first came to populate North America has always been a fiercely argued question. As Stephanie Tsai reports, a new study laying out what archaeologists believe are the oldest human footprints ever found on American soil is raising fresh questions and shaking up assumptions that have stood for decades, 61 of them. Strikingly clear, the toes are visible, the curve of the arch is there, some are tiny, a child's foot. Others belong to adults moving at speed, nearly at a run. This is not some distant, abstract artifact like a stone tool or a fragment of bone. This is a living moment. A group of people, kids among them, walking the shoreline of an ice-age lake on some unremarkable day, pressing their feet into soft mud that the sun dried hard and sediment then swallowed, holding them in darkness until someone crossed over them again. Thousands of years on, you are not simply reading about these people. You are standing exactly where they stood. They were here, alive, mid-stride, heading somewhere, at a moment when every textbook insists no human being had yet set a single foot on this continent. The first dates arrived in 2021, drawn from radiocarbon testing on seeds of a plant called spiral ditch grass, pulled from the same sediment layers as the prints, 21,000 to 23,000 years old. Skeptics moved in fast, and honestly, they raised a legitimate concern. The seeds might have absorbed ancient carbon dissolved in groundwater, making them appear far older than they actually were. That is precisely the kind of challenge solid science has to be able to withstand. So the team ran new tests, this time using conifer pollen, which pulls no carbon from groundwater and comes directly from trees that were living at the time the prints were made. The result was the same, 21 to 23,000 years. Then, in June of 2025, a third study published in Science Advances approached the question from a completely different direction, using organic material drawn from wetland mud and shallow lake sediments. 3 separate sources now, seeds, pollen, and mud, each tested independently. Every single one pointed to the same window of time, the peak of the last ice age, at the very moment the textbooks declare North America was entirely uninhabited. And those people were not wandering alone. Their prints appear alongside tracks left by Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, massive ice age creatures that disappeared from the continent thousands of years ago, all preserved together in the same ancient mud at the same point in time. Human beings and enormous beasts sharing a shoreline that, according to the established record, no human eye had ever looked upon. This is what Oregon set in motion. 2 sites in Oregon had already pushed the accepted date back considerably, and once the scientific community had no choice but to take Oregon seriously, the rest of the accumulated evidence stopped appearing like a collection of errors and started reading like a consistent pattern. White Sands was now showing entire family groups traveling across the continent deep in the heart of the Ice Age, far from any glacial corridor, at a time when the old model said the route into the Americas had not yet become passable. But White Sands only reaches back to around 23,000 years. Something in Southern California is so much older, it makes White Sands seem recent by comparison, and no one was searching for it. They were laying down a freeway. A construction crew working in Southern California was cutting through earth when the blade struck bone. Work came to a halt. There had been no archaeological survey, no research funding, no agenda of any kind. Just workers, heavy equipment, and a road that needed to get built. A foreman walked up to a curved shape embedded in the soil that was clearly neither rock nor pipe. The unmistakable contour of something that had once been a living creature. Paleontologists were brought in, and what they carefully extracted were the partial remains of a single mastodon, an elephant-like animal that died out at the close of the Ice Age. But the bones had not simply fallen there and fossilized in place. As the team carefully cleared away the dirt, layer by layer, a creeping sense of unease moved through everyone gathered around that excavation pit. They were not staring at a fossil, they were staring at a scene. Something intentional had been done to these bones. The mastodon bones displayed spiral fractures, the precise kind of break that only occurs in fresh bone. That detail alone transforms a fossil site into something resembling a crime scene. Old fossilized bone is dry and brittle, shattering when it breaks. Fresh bone, bone still carrying moisture and life, twists and spirals as it gives way. Someone had cracked these open while they were still fresh, almost certainly to get at the marrow inside. That rich, fatty reward that prehistoric people valued so highly. This was not scavenging or some accident of nature. This was butchery. A deliberate, practiced technique carried out by someone who knew precisely how to extract everything useful from a carcass. And scattered among the bones were 5 large cobbles, fist-sized stones, far too heavy to have been carried there by flowing water. Geologists confirmed it. Water had nothing to do with it. People brought them there. Hammerstones and anvils, hauled to that exact spot, used to smash the bones open, and then left behind in the dirt when whoever did it simply walked away and never returned. Here is the number that empties the room. The bone was dated using uranium-thorium analysis, and every single test came back with the same answer. Around 130,700 years old. Read that twice, because it does not belong in the same sentence as anything you have heard up to this point. 130,700 years. To give that some scale, the oldest find we have discussed so far, setting aside the Karuti bones, was somewhere around 23,000 years old. This is more than 5 times older than that. It is older than the point at which our own species is broadly believed to have expanded out of Africa. It is a number so far beyond the accepted timeline that for years, the most comfortable response was simply to assume someone had made an error. In 2017, Nature published it. The authors, Stephen Holen, Kathleen Holen, Thomas Demarais, and Richard Fulligar, wrote it in the most carefully hedged, technically cautious language they could manage, and it still detonated like a bomb. Some form of human species was present in North America 130,700 years ago. Not modern humans, not Neanderthals. Something the existing models do not even have a category for. Most of the field simply refuses to engage with the site. Not because anyone has disproven it, but because it is too radical, too difficult to explain, and too damaging to too many established careers to even acknowledge seriously. Looking away is easier. So the question just hangs there, unanswered, the way genuinely uncomfortable questions in science tend to do. Who cracked open those bones? Nobody knows. Nobody can even make a reasonable guess. It was not a modern human, because modern humans had no business being anywhere near the Americas that early. It was not a Neanderthal either. It was some other branch of the human family, present in California more than 100,000 years before the story is supposed to have begun. Doing something as deeply intimate and recognizably human as breaking open a bone to get at what was inside. But it places Oregon's discovery inside a much larger and stranger frame. If Oregon demonstrated that people were here long before Clovis, California is whispering that someone or something was here 100,000 years before even that, which pulls us straight back to the question Oregon could not answer alone. How did any of them actually get here? Because the old answer, that single frozen doorway out of Siberia, is beginning to come apart. A different door. For an entire century, the answer was a single word, Beringia, the land bridge from Siberia, exposed when so much of the world's water was locked away inside glaciers. One door, opening once, everyone walking through on foot, moving north to south, exactly the way the textbook diagram always illustrated it, with one clean arrow. It was simple. And simple is easy to teach, but Oregon's western-stemmed tools look nothing like anything that came walking out of that corridor. And that is the loose thread, the one that, once you pull it, unravels the entire map. If the earliest toolmakers in Oregon were not carrying the Clovis toolkit that supposedly passed through that gateway, then perhaps they never came through it at all. Consider a place that should have made arrival completely impossible: Crete. The island has existed as an island for roughly 5 million years. Not once was it connected to the mainland during any period humans have been around. Walking to Crete was never an option. Anyone who ever stepped onto its shores had to cross a minimum of 40 miles of open water, and not by clinging to a drifting log, but aboard a properly constructed vessel, built deliberately by someone who genuinely understood the sea. A team led by Thomas Strayer and Alani Panagopalu discovered stone tools at 2 locations on Crete that date somewhere between 130,000 and 700,000 years old, resembling the handiwork of Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus, human ancestors who lived long before modern people came into existence. If those early beings could navigate the Mediterranean that far back, then the comfortable assumption that ancient humans were incapable of handling open water was done for. And that assumption was carrying a lot of weight. The entire reason everyone insisted the first Americans had to arrive on foot was rooted in the belief that early people simply lacked the ability to cross open ocean, that boats were a sophisticated, late modern invention. Crete says otherwise. Crete tells us that people were constructing seaworthy vessels a full 100,000 years before anyone imagined they could manage it. As one member of the research team expressed it, if early humans were moving through the Mediterranean before 130,000 years ago, they were perfectly capable of crossing other stretches of water as well. That single sentence throws open every migration map that has ever been drawn. Now carry that idea back across the world. Researchers tracing a mitochondrial lineage known as D4H followed it to the northern coastline of China. What the data revealed was not one migration, it showed 2. The first wave, occurring around 26,000 years ago, most likely followed the shoreline by boat, moving northward from China through Japan and out into the Pacific, camp by camp, tracking fish and shellfish and the rhythm of the tides. Not a desperate do-or-die crossing, but a gradual, patient movement along the edge of a continent. One temporary settlement at a time, perhaps spanning many generations. Picture it clearly. Small groups living off the coastal shore, never truly out of sight of land. The children of each camp growing up to paddle just a little further than their parents ever had. No single grand heroic voyage, only the sea and time and a coastline that stretched endlessly onward. The second wave, roughly 15,000 years ago, came overland through Beringia, and that second group is the one connected to the Clovis era populations, everyone once declared the very first Americans. They were not first. They arrived late, following a path that others had already traveled by sea thousands of years before them. Think about what that does to the entire picture most of us grew up with. The Clovis hunters, with their distinctive spear points, the figures standing at the front of every museum diorama, were not bold pioneers breaking into an untouched world. They were latecomers, walking onto a continent that had already been explored, settled, and crossed by people who took an entirely different route. The heroes of the old story turn out to be the newcomers, and the tools themselves back this up. Identical stoneworking techniques appear across China, Japan, and the Americas. The same blade styles, the same point shapes, the same decisions about how to strike a piece of stone and produce a working edge. That is not coincidence. Tools do not independently develop in the same way across locations thousands of miles apart from one another. That is a trail, a chain of people carrying the same craft with them across the water. And it leads directly back to the coast of China, the very same distinct tradition that Oregon's western-stemmed tools belong to. The knife buried beneath ash at Rimrock Draw was not some puzzling anomaly. It was a clue pointing straight across an ocean. So the neat, tidy story has collapsed. The first Americans were not who we were told they were. They did not arrive when we were taught. They may not have even walked here at all. A handful of dry caves out in Oregon cracked that timeline wide open. A weathered blade beneath volcanic rock pushed the truth even further down. Footprints uncovered in New Mexico, shattered bones in California, and genetic material recovered from coastal China, all lined up behind the same staggering conclusion: Oregon had reached first. The continent was never empty and waiting to be discovered. It was already inhabited, already traveled, already home to people whose history runs far older, far stranger, and far more complicated than anyone was comfortable acknowledging. And every thread keeps looping back to the same location. Not New Mexico, not California, not the shores of China, Oregon, a cluster of dry caves, and a wind-battered rock shelter sitting in the high desert, where the soil finally surrendered evidence the scientific community could no longer brush aside. And the tidy, comfortable narrative began unraveling right at its edges. Somewhere out there at this very moment, buried in ground no one is disturbed yet, the next piece of the puzzle is already sitting there, waiting for whoever digs far enough to reach it. So who split open a mastodon's bones in California 130,700 years ago, then left their stone tools behind and disappeared? Drop your theory in the comments, because the honest truth right now is that no one has the answer. If this shook you the way it shook us, go ahead and tap subscribe, hit the like button, and pull up the next video on your screen, because the next excavation is already happening. And when it comes to light, we will be right here to walk you through every single thing they uncovered.